Imagine you're a general commanding an army of 1 million men. You have tanks, artillery, prepared defenses, and allies. Now imagine your enemy has a smaller army with weaker tanks. Logic says you should win. But what if I told you that within 6 weeks, your million-man army would be shattered, your capital occupied, and your nation forced to surrender, not because your enemy was stronger, but because they moved faster than you could think? This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This is exactly what happened in the spring of 1940, when Germany conquered France in one of the most stunning military victories in human history. And the weapon that made it possible wasn't a secret supertank or a wonder weapon. It was speed itself. May 10th, 1940, 4:35 a.m. Along the Belgian and Dutch borders, thousands of soldiers stood at their posts in the pre-dawn darkness. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Then they heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but the sky was cloudless. Within minutes, the thunder became a roar, and the roar became a shriek as German Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the darkness, their sirens wailing like the end of the world. By 5 a.m., bridges were destroyed, communication centers obliterated, border posts annihilated. The German invasion of Western Europe had begun. But this wasn't like any invasion the world had seen before. This wasn't going to be like World War I, where armies faced each other across trenches for 4 years. This was going to be over in weeks, and the reason why would change warfare forever. The Germans were about to prove that in modern war, speed kills more effectively than firepower, that moving faster than your enemy can react is more powerful than having more guns, that victory goes not to the biggest army, but to the fastest thinking one. But to understand how this happened, we need to go back 2 years earlier to September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, and the world got its first glimpse of what was coming. 4:45 a.m., September 1st, 1939. The Polish town of Wielon lay sleeping under a peaceful sky. It had no military installations, no strategic importance. It had a hospital, clearly marked with red crosses on its roof. None of that mattered. German bombers appeared overhead and destroyed the town in minutes, killing 1,200 civilians. It was the opening move in a campaign that would demonstrate a revolutionary new way of making war. The German invasion plan for Poland looked conventional on paper, forces attacking from the north, west, and south, aiming to encircle Polish armies. But the execution was anything but conventional. Leading the advance were panzer divisions commanded by a general named Heinz Guderian, and what he did in Poland would become a blueprint for modern mechanized warfare. Guderian wasn't interested in destroying every Polish position he encountered. He was interested in speed. His tanks bypassed strong defensive positions, raced through gaps in Polish lines, and penetrated deep into Polish territory before Polish commanders even understood what was happening. Behind the panzers came the Luftwaffe, providing close air support, bombing anything that might slow the advance. And behind the aircraft came infantry, mopping up the bypassed positions. Polish forces were brave and reasonably well equipped. Their defensive plan was solid by World War I standards, but they were fighting a World War I battle while the Germans were fighting something entirely new. Within 3 days, Polish commanders were receiving reports that made no sense. German tanks spotted here, but that's 50 miles behind our front lines. How did they get there? German armor reported here, but they would have had to go through 2 divisions to reach that position. The reports were correct. That was exactly what Guderian had done. His panzers hadn't tried to fight through Polish defenses, they'd simply gone around them, exploiting any gap, any weakness, moving so fast that by the time Polish forces organized to respond, the situation had completely changed. Here's what made this so devastating. War is fundamentally about decision-making. You observe the situation, you analyze it, you decide what to do, and you implement your decision. This cycle takes time. The Polish military command structure needed hours to gather information, assess it, issue orders, and have those orders reach frontline units. By the time Polish forces received orders to defend Position A, the Germans were already attacking Position B. By the time Polish reinforcements arrived at Position B, the Germans were behind them at Position C. Guderian was operating inside the Polish decision cycle. He was creating new situations faster than Polish commanders could respond to old situations. It wasn't that the Poles couldn't fight, it was that they couldn't figure out what to fight or where to fight it. On September 3rd, the commander of a Polish mechanized brigade tried explaining this to his superior officer. "Sir, they're not trying to destroy us in place. They're trying to paralyze us. Every time we prepare a defense, they're already past it. Every time we fall back to regroup, they're waiting for us. We're not losing because we can't fight them. We're losing because we can't find them long enough to fight them." His commander, a veteran of World War I, shook his head. "Tanks cannot operate independently for long. They need supply, fuel, maintenance. They're overextended. Basic military logic says they must consolidate. We'll cut them off and destroy them." But they never got the chance. 18 days. That's how long it took Germany to conquer Poland. 18 days to defeat an army of nearly 1 million men defending their homeland. The world watched Poland fall and learned the wrong lesson. In Paris, French generals looked at maps and nodded to themselves. The Poles were unprepared, they said, not like us. They looked at the Maginot Line, the most formidable defensive fortifications ever constructed, stretching along the German border like a wall of steel and concrete. They looked at their army of 4 million men. They looked at their tanks, which were actually better than German tanks. Heavier armor, bigger guns. They felt safe. In London, British politicians breathed easier. Poland was tragic, certainly, but Poland was far away and poorly prepared. Britain had the English Channel. Britain had the Royal Navy. Britain had time to mobilize, to build up forces, to prepare properly for whatever came next. Some politicians even suggested that maybe Hitler would be satisfied now that he'd conquered Poland. Maybe peace negotiations were possible. Only a few people understood what had really happened in Poland. One was a French colonel named Charles de Gaulle, who'd spent years advocating for mechanized warfare and been ignored by his superiors. Another was a BBC correspondent named Claire Hollingworth, who'd witnessed the invasion firsthand. She tried to explain it in her broadcasts. The German tactics are unlike anything in modern warfare. They don't fight in the traditional sense. They move, constantly, rapidly, unpredictably. Polish forces weren't defeated in battle. They were scattered, confused, bypassed. Her editors toned down her reports. British audiences didn't want to know about revolutionary German tactics. They wanted reassurance that Britain's declaration of war would make things right. And so the world went back to sleep. Poland was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The phony war began. 8 months where British and French troops sat in their fortifications and German troops sat in theirs, and nothing happened. French soldiers played cards behind the Maginot Line. British troops dug trenches and waited. It was the strangest war anyone had ever seen. But while Allied forces sat idle, Guderian was training. He spent the winter of 1939-1940 drilling his panzer commanders on a single principle. When you see an opportunity, take it immediately. Don't ask permission. Don't wait for orders. Don't worry about maintaining contact with units beside you. If you wait, the opportunity closes. Your job isn't to follow a plan. Your job is to keep the enemy from making a plan. This was revolutionary. Traditional military doctrine demanded strict hierarchy. Junior officers followed orders from senior officers, who followed orders from generals, who coordinated everything from headquarters far behind the lines. Guderian was teaching his officers to make instant decisions based on what they could see right in front of them. He drilled them relentlessly on field exercises where communication would suddenly cut out, where scenarios changed without warning, where they had to decide in seconds whether to advance or retreat or pivot completely. He wanted them uncomfortable in training so they'd be confident in battle. He was particularly harsh on officers who hesitated. After one exercise where a commander paused for 10 minutes to assess a situation before acting, Guderian dressed him down in front of everyone. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, the enemy is moved. The situation has changed. Your information is already obsolete. Better to make a decision that's 80% right immediately than a decision that's perfect 10 minutes too late. While Guderian trained his troops, another German officer was planning something audacious. General Erich von Manstein was developing an operational plan so bold that most of the German general staff thought it was insane. The original German plan for invading France was straightforward. Attack through Belgium, just like 1914, push south toward Paris. The problem was obvious. The French expected exactly this. They'd spent 20 years preparing for it. They had positions ready in Belgium, agreements to rush troops forward the moment Germany attacked. Manstein proposed something different. Send Army Group B through Belgium and the Netherlands. Make it obvious, make it loud. The French and British will rush north to meet what they think is your main attack. And while they're moving north, while all their attention is on Belgium, send your real striking force through the Ardennes forest. Every military textbook said the Ardennes were impassable for armor. The region was heavily forested, hilly, with narrow roads. The French were so certain tanks couldn't get through that they'd left it lightly defended. The Maginot Line stopped where the Ardennes began. Manstein's plan was to send 7 panzer divisions, including Guderian's corps, through the impassable Ardennes, break through French defenses at Sedan, cross the Meuse River, and then race west to the English Channel. Not south toward Paris, west to the coast. Cut off the Allied armies that had rushed into Belgium, trap them with the sea at their backs. The traditional generals hated this plan. You were splitting your forces, sending your best units through terrible terrain, creating vulnerable flanks, gambling everything on the enemy doing exactly what you predicted. Every principle of conventional military wisdom said this was reckless. But Hitler loved it. Not because he understood the military logic, but because it was dramatic, unexpected, bold, the kind of move that would humiliate his enemies. In February 1940, Hitler personally approved Manstein's plan over the objections of his general staff. By May 1940, everything was ready. German panzer divisions assembled in forests near the Belgian border, hidden from Allied reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe programmed its targets, infantry units moved into position, and in the Ardennes, narrow forest roads waited for the test of whether tanks really could pass through. On the Allied side, preparations were far less complete. The French had spent billions on the Maginot Line and now were planning to abandon it to fight in Belgium. The British Expeditionary Force was professional but small, fewer than 400,000 men. The Belgians had declared neutrality and refused to coordinate defense plans, terrified that cooperation with the Allies would provoke German attack. Everyone knew war was coming, but they thought they knew how it would unfold. Belgium first, then a long campaign, time to mobilize, to organize, to coordinate. They expected World War I with better equipment. What they were about to get was something entirely different. May 9, 1940, evening. British intelligence officers reviewed aerial reconnaissance photographs and noticed something odd, unusual German vehicle concentrations near the Ardennes. They flagged it for their superiors. The report was filed away. The Ardennes were impassable. Everyone knew that, probably just routine traffic. That night, German soldiers moved into final assault positions. Panzer crews performed last checks on their tanks. Luftwaffe pilots reviewed their target maps. Stuka dive bomber crews tested their sirens, those psychological weapons designed to create terror in anyone who heard them. And all along the Belgian and Dutch borders, soldiers checked their watches and waited for the order to attack. 4:35 a.m., May 10, 1940. The order came. The Luftwaffe struck first. Hundreds of aircraft appeared over Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France, bombing bridges, airfields, communication centers. The goal wasn't just destruction, it was paralysis. Cut communications so commanders couldn't coordinate, destroy bridges so reinforcements couldn't move, create chaos so nobody could organize an effective response. At 6 a.m., German ground forces crossed the borders. In the north, Army Group B smashed into the Netherlands and Belgium with overwhelming force. This was the obvious attack, the one everyone expected. Dutch and Belgian forces fought hard, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Dutch deployed water barriers, flooding fields to create obstacles. German engineers bridged them in hours. Belgian forces fell back to prepared positions. German armor bypassed them. The Dutch and Belgian governments immediately called for help. France and Britain responded exactly as the plan predicted. They rushed north to Belgium. The French First Army, the British Expeditionary Force, and some of France's best mechanized divisions raced into Belgium to meet what they thought was the main German offensive. General Maurice Gamelin, the French Supreme Commander, reviewed his reports from his headquarters and felt confident. The Germans were doing exactly what French intelligence had predicted. French and British forces were moving to strong defensive positions in Belgium. Everything was proceeding according to plan. He had no idea that while he congratulated himself, 45,000 German vehicles were moving through the Ardennes forest in a column stretching over 60 miles. Guderian was near the front of that massive column, coordinating the advance. Every delay made him anxious. Every hour in the forest was an hour the French might discover them. But the movement had to be careful. A traffic jam in these narrow roads would be catastrophic, leaving thousands of vehicles sitting helpless in a forest with no room to maneuver. The roads through the Ardennes were terrible for armor. Single-lane tracks winding through dense forest and steep hills. Tanks had to move in single file. When a bridge was found too weak for heavy vehicles, engineers didn't wait for reinforcements. They found another route immediately. When scouts reported Belgian units ahead, the panzers went around rather than stopping to fight. Keep moving, always moving. French reconnaissance aircraft did spot the German columns moving through the Ardennes on May 10th and 11th. Pilots reported massive vehicle concentrations, but French commanders dismissed these reports. Trucks and light vehicles, perhaps, but tanks? Impossible. The Ardennes were impossible for armor. Everyone knew that. The pilots must be mistaken about what they're seeing. This dismissal of evidence that contradicted existing beliefs would prove fatal. French military doctrine, developed over decades, said the Ardennes couldn't be crossed by armor. Therefore, reports of armor in the Ardennes must be wrong. It never occurred to French commanders that their doctrine might be outdated, that what was difficult might not be impossible, that an enemy might attempt something they considered unthinkable. On May 12th, 3 days into the invasion, the lead elements of Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps reached the Meuse River at Sedan. This was the critical moment. The Meuse was a natural defensive barrier. French troops held the western bank. Not many, because nobody expected a major attack here. But any river crossing is dangerous. You have to get men across under fire, establish a bridgehead, hold it long enough to bring heavy equipment over. Traditional military doctrine said it would take days to prepare properly, to bring up artillery, to soften enemy defenses, to organize a methodical assault. Guderian didn't have days. Every hour of delay was an hour the French could use to rush reinforcements to Sedan. He decided to cross immediately, the next afternoon, less than 24 hours after reaching the river. His staff officers were horrified. Cross a defended river in broad daylight with minimal preparation against French fortifications? It was suicide. Guderian was unmoved. Speed was more important than caution. Surprise was more valuable than preparation. They would cross tomorrow. May 13, 1940 began with the most concentrated air attack yet seen in warfare. Starting at noon, wave after wave of German aircraft hammered French positions along the Meuse. Stukas dive bombing with those horrific sirens screaming, medium bombers dropping their loads, fighters strafing anything that moved. For 5 continuous hours, the bombing never stopped. It wasn't designed primarily to destroy fortifications, though it did that. It was designed to break the will of the defenders through sheer psychological pressure. The French troops defending Sedan were reservists from the 55th Infantry Division. They were middle-aged men, many World War I veterans, manning concrete bunkers and fortified positions. They were brave enough, but they'd been sitting in quiet garrison duty for 8 months, and now suddenly they were in hell. Bombs falling continuously, buildings collapsing, bunkers cracking under repeated hits, communications cut, no orders from headquarters, just endless explosions and the shrieking of Stukas, and the feeling that the world itself was ending. At 4 p.m., under cover of this aerial bombardment, German combat engineers launched assault boats into the Meuse. French defenders fired on them despite the bombing. Many boats were hit. Men drowned in the cold water, but more boats kept coming. German artillery on the eastern bank fired smoke shells to screen the crossing. More boats appeared through the smoke. The defenders were overwhelmed, not by force of numbers, but by the relentlessness of the assault combined with the ongoing air attack. By midnight, the Germans had a bridgehead on the western bank. Engineers immediately began constructing pontoon bridges. By dawn on May 14th, the first German tanks were crossing the Meuse at Sedan. This was the moment when the entire campaign hung in the balance. The Germans were across the river, yes, but concentrated in a small area. A strong counterattack now might drive them back, destroy the bridges, stop the breakthrough. The French Second Army commander, General Charles Hunziger, immediately called for reinforcements and air support. But the reinforcements were in Belgium.
The French and British mobile forces, the best units, the ones that could respond quickly, had all moved north to fight what they thought was the main German offensive. Hunsinger called again, more urgently. "I need tanks. I need them now. The Germans are across the Meuse in force at Sedan." The response? Impossible. The tank units are committed in Belgium. They cannot be withdrawn. "Then send me air support. Bombers. We must destroy those bridges." The French and British air forces tried. They sent wave after wave of bombers against the German bridges at Sedan on May 14th. The Luftwaffe massacred them. German fighters dominated the airspace. Anti-aircraft guns surrounded the crossing points. Of 152 bombers sent to attack the bridges that day, 71 were shot down. The few bombs that hit the bridges did minimal damage. Pontoon bridges were easy to repair, and German engineers had redundant crossing points. By May 15th, Guderian had his entire 19th Panzer Corps across the Meuse. Now came the next crucial decision. His orders were to establish a secure bridgehead and wait for infantry to catch up before advancing further. This was sound military doctrine. Consolidate your gains, ensure your supply lines, maintain cohesion with supporting units. Guderian ignored his orders completely. He attacked west, full speed. His superiors were furious. Radio messages ordered him to halt, consolidate, wait. Guderian radioed back that he was conducting a reconnaissance in force to assess enemy positions. Then he essentially turned off his radio and kept moving. This act of insubordination was critical to the entire campaign's success. Guderian understood something his superiors didn't. The French were confused right now, disoriented, trying to figure out what was happening. Give them time and they'd organize a response, rush reinforcements south, coordinate a counterattack. But if he kept moving, kept the pressure on, kept creating new crises faster than they could respond to old ones, the confusion would deepen into paralysis. Every hour of hesitation was an hour of opportunity for the enemy. Every mile gained was a mile that would have to be fought over later if not taken now. Speed. Always speed. Stay inside the enemy's decision cycle. The French military command structure was indeed paralyzed by confusion. Reports flooded in from all directions. Germans attacking in Belgium, Germans across the Meuse at Sedan, German armor reported near Montcornet, but that's 40 miles west of Sedan. They couldn't have advanced that far that quickly. More reports. Germans at Amiens, at Amiville. It made no sense. The reports had to be wrong. Maybe panicked soldiers seeing German vehicles that weren't really there. Maybe exaggerated estimates. Maybe enemy recon elements being mistaken for main forces. The reports were accurate. Guderian's panzers were racing west at speeds nobody thought possible. 40 miles a day, 50 miles a day. Not stopping to fight every French position they encountered, just bypassing them. Refueling on the move, pausing only when they absolutely had to. Behind the panzers, the situation was chaotic. German infantry struggled to keep up. Supply lines were stretched impossibly thin. Guderian's tanks were often hours ahead of their fuel trucks, operating on fumes, gambling that they'd capture French fuel dumps before running dry. Staff officers in German headquarters stared at maps in disbelief. On May 16th, 1 week into the invasion, Guderian's lead elements were 60 miles beyond the Meuse. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Every military textbook said mechanized forces couldn't sustain this pace. They should have run out of fuel. They should be vulnerable to counterattack with their flanks exposed. But it was working because the French couldn't counterattack. French armor was designed to support infantry, not to operate independently. French tanks were better than German tanks individually, heavier armor, bigger guns, but French doctrine scattered them among infantry divisions rather than concentrating them in dedicated armored formations. When orders came to organize a counterattack against Guderian's flanks, French commanders discovered they couldn't quickly assemble enough tanks in one place to make it effective. More critically, French decision-making was too slow. By the time recon found German positions, reported them to headquarters, headquarters analyzed the information, decided on a response, and those orders reached frontline units, the German positions had moved. The French were fighting yesterday's battle, responding to where the Germans had been rather than where they were. On May 16th, barely a week into the campaign, the French government began to panic. Premier Paul Reynaud telephoned Winston Churchill, who'd become British Prime Minister just 6 days earlier. "The Germans have broken through," Reynaud said, his voice shaking. "They're racing for the coast. If they reach it, they'll cut off all our forces in Belgium. Our armies will be trapped." Churchill flew to Paris immediately. At a meeting with French commanders, he asked a simple question. "Where are your strategic reserves, the mobile forces you'll use to counterattack and stop this breakthrough?" General Maurice Gamelin looked at Churchill with haunted eyes and said simply, "There are no reserves."
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Churchill, who'd commanded troops in World War I, who'd seen terrible things, who prided himself on never being at a loss for words, couldn't speak for several seconds. No reserves. The French had committed everything to their initial deployment. They'd assumed that if a breakthrough happened, they'd have time to shift forces to meet it, time to organize, time to coordinate. They'd assumed the enemy would move at World War I speeds, a few miles per day at most, allowing days or weeks to respond. Guderian's panzers were moving 40 miles per day. On May 20th, 10 days into the campaign, German tanks reached the English Channel at Abbeville. They'd crossed France from the German border to the sea in less than 2 weeks. It was one of the fastest military advances in history. And it meant that every French and British unit that had rushed into Belgium, the entire Belgian army, most of the French First Army, all 9 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force, was now trapped in a pocket with the sea at their backs. Nearly 2 million men, cut off from the main French armies to the south, surrounded on 3 sides by German forces, facing potential annihilation. In London, Churchill's government stared at the maps in horror. If the British Expeditionary Force was destroyed, Britain would be defenseless. There were emergency meetings about whether to negotiate peace while some bargaining power remained, about whether the war was already lost. But the trapped armies weren't defeated yet, just trapped, and there was one port still open, still accessible, where evacuation might be possible: Dunkirk. Guderian's panzers were within 15 miles of Dunkirk by May 24th. The port was barely defended. British and French forces were streaming toward it in chaos, trying desperately to form a defensive perimeter. If Guderian pushed forward immediately, he could take Dunkirk in a day. The evacuation would be impossible. The Allied armies would be forced to surrender. It would be the greatest military disaster in British history. Guderian wanted to attack. His tanks were ready. His men were ready. They'd come this far. One more push and the campaign would be over, the victory complete. And then the order came down: halt. This order, one of the most controversial of the entire war, came from Hitler himself. For 3 days, German panzers sat idle outside Dunkirk while British and French forces established defensive positions. Why Hitler gave this order is still debated by historians. Some argue he wanted the Luftwaffe to have the glory of finishing the British. Some believe his generals convinced him the tanks needed rest after their incredible advance. Some suggest he thought leaving an escape route might make the British more amenable to peace negotiations. Whatever the reason, those 3 days saved the British Expeditionary Force. They allowed Allied forces to establish a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk. They made the evacuation possible. From May 27th to June 4th, Operation Dynamo evacuated 338,226 British and French troops from Dunkirk across the English Channel to Britain. It required every available ship, destroyers, fishing boats, private yachts, anything that could float. The Luftwaffe attacked constantly, sinking ships, strafing beaches, but the evacuation succeeded. The British left behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles, supplies, but they saved the men. Churchill called it a miracle.
He also reminded Parliament that wars are not won by evacuations. Britain had avoided annihilation, but France was finished. The French tried to hold a defensive line along the Somme River with what remained of their army. On June 5th, German forces attacked. The line broke in 2 days. Guderian's panzers were loose in central France. Paris was declared an open city. The French government abandoned it rather than see it destroyed in battle. On June 14th, German troops marched into Paris unopposed, down the Champs-Élysées, past the Arc de Triomphe, swastika flags flying over the city that had been the symbol of Allied victory in 1918. On June 22nd, France surrendered. Hitler insisted the ceremony take place in the same railway car in the exact same location where Germany had surrendered to France in 1918. He wanted the symbolism, the humiliation, the reversal of fortune. 6 weeks. That's how long it took Germany to defeat France and Britain, the two greatest military powers in Western Europe, the powers that had defeated Germany in 4 years of brutal fighting just 22 years earlier. 6 weeks to accomplish what everyone thought would take years. The world was stunned. How had this happened? How had the largest army in Europe collapsed so quickly? How had the Maginot Line, that supposed masterpiece of defensive engineering, become irrelevant? The answer wasn't secret weapons or superior German equipment. French tanks were better than German tanks. French and British forces combined outnumbered German forces. The Allies had more artillery, more supplies, more of almost everything. What the Germans had was speed. Not just speed of movement, though that mattered. Speed of decision-making, speed of adaptation, the ability to process information and act on it faster than the enemy could process information and react. Think about warfare as a conversation between two commanders. You make a move, your opponent responds. You adapt to their response. They adapt to your adaptation. It's like a chess game, but played with armies and with stakes measured in nations rather than pieces. Now imagine one player makes 5 moves for every 1 move their opponent makes. Your opponent is still thinking about how to respond to your first move while you're already making your second, third, fourth move. They're constantly responding to situations that no longer exist. They're always reacting, never acting, always 1 step behind, then 2 steps, then completely lost. That was the 1940 campaign. The French military command needed hours to gather information from frontline units, assess it at various levels of command, make decisions, and transmit those orders back to those units. By the time French forces received orders to respond to a situation, the situation had completely changed. German panzer commanders with radios in their tanks could observe a situation, make a decision, and implement that decision in minutes. They didn't wait for orders from higher headquarters. They were authorized, even encouraged, to exploit opportunities immediately. This difference in decision-making speed was more decisive than any difference in equipment. It meant German forces were always creating new problems faster than Allied forces could solve old problems. It meant French commanders were always fighting yesterday's battle. It meant that confusion and paralysis spread through the French command structure like a virus, with each level unable to understand what was happening at the level below it. The campaign demonstrated something that would reshape military thinking for the rest of the century. In modern warfare, tempo matters more than mass. The side that thinks and acts faster can defeat a larger, better-equipped enemy by staying inside their decision cycle. By the time your enemy figures out what's happening, you're already moved on to the next phase. They're responding to threats that no longer exist, while you're creating new threats they haven't recognized yet. This principle, that speed of decision-making is itself a weapon, would influence every military conflict that followed. The Americans would build their entire military doctrine around it. The Soviets would learn the hard way when Germany invaded in 1941. Even today, modern militaries organize themselves to maximize decision-making speed, to get information from sensors to shooters as quickly as possible, to enable commanders at every level to act on opportunities without waiting for permission. But in 1940, it was a revelation. The French had spent billions on fortifications and millions training their army, and none of it mattered, because their decision-making process was too slow for modern warfare. They were fighting a 1918 war in 1940. They were trying to execute carefully coordinated movements when the situation changed faster than their coordination process could function. The consequences were catastrophic. France, which had been considered the premier military power in Europe, was conquered in 6 weeks. Britain was driven from the continent and barely avoided the destruction of its army. Germany dominated Western Europe. The strategic situation was completely transformed. And it had all happened because one side understood that speed, in movement, in communication, in decision-making, had become as important as firepower. That creating confusion in the enemy's command structure was as valuable as destroying enemy units. That paralysis achieved through tempo was as effective as destruction achieved through force. The irony is that this lesson was learned but not fully absorbed by the Germans themselves. They thought their success proved they were invincible, that their tactics would work anywhere, against anyone. They didn't understand that they'd succeeded partly because their opponents were unprepared for this style of warfare. They didn't realize that other nations were watching, learning, adapting. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, they used the same tactics, and initially they achieved the same spectacular successes: massive encirclements, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers captured, advances hundreds of miles deep. But the Soviets adapted. They learned to trade space for time, to accept encirclements and keep fighting, to organize new armies faster than the Germans could destroy old ones. The tactics that overwhelmed France in 6 weeks weren't enough to conquer Russia. Meanwhile, the Americans were building an entirely new army based on lessons from France, an army designed around speed, flexibility, and decentralized decision-making, an army with radios at every level, with officers trained to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders, with logistics designed to support rapid advances. When American forces landed in North Africa in 1942 and France in 1944, they were the ones implementing Guderian's principles, and the Germans found themselves on the receiving end of the tactics they'd pioneered. But all of that was still in the future. In June 1940, as German troops marched through Paris and swastika flags flew over conquered capitals, it seemed like the Germans had discovered the secret to invincible warfare. They hadn't. They'd discovered one important principle of modern war: that speed creates its own advantages, that tempo can overcome mass, that paralyzing your enemy's decision-making is as valuable as destroying their forces. It was a powerful principle, but it wasn't magic. It wasn't invincible. It was just one factor among many, and like any military innovation, its effectiveness depended partly on the enemy's lack of preparation for it. The lesson of 1940 wasn't that speed makes you unstoppable. The lesson was that in modern warfare, you must be able to think and act as fast as your enemy, or faster. That decision-making speed is itself a capability that must be developed, practiced, and institutionalized. That military organizations must be structured to enable rapid decision-making at every level, not just at the top. This lesson has been relearned in every conflict since. In the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel defeated 3 Arab armies in less than a week using similar principles: preemptive strikes, rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, operations inside the enemy's decision cycle. In the 1991 Gulf War, the coalition defeated Iraq in 100 hours of ground combat using speed and maneuver to paralyze Iraqi command and control. In conflicts today, the struggle for decision-making speed continues with drones and cyber warfare and artificial intelligence, all technologies aimed at observing, deciding, and acting faster than the enemy. The Germans in 1940 didn't invent these concepts. Military theorists had been writing about tempo and decision cycles for decades, but the Germans were the first to implement these concepts effectively at operational scale, and the world paid attention to the results. France fell not because French soldiers were cowards, they weren't. Not because French equipment was inferior, it wasn't. France fell because French military thinking was too slow for modern warfare, because their command structure needed hours to process information that should have taken minutes, because they were fighting by 1918 rules in a 1940 war. And that's the final lesson of 1940. Success in warfare depends on understanding what kind of war you're actually fighting, not the war you prepared for or the war you want to fight. The French prepared brilliantly for World War I, fought with 1940 technology. The Germans prepared adequately for an entirely different kind of war, based on speed and tempo. Preparation matters, but preparing for the wrong war is worse than inadequate preparation for the right war. As the summer of 1940 faded into autumn, with France occupied and Britain standing alone, the question everyone asked was simple. How did this happen? How did the impossible become inevitable? How did what everyone said couldn't be done get done in 6 weeks? The answer was there in the wreckage of French divisions, in the abandoned tanks and artillery littering the roads, in the stunned faces of soldiers who'd been ready to fight but never got the chance because they could never figure out where to fight or what to fight. Speed had become a weapon, not the speed of bullets or shells, but the speed of thought and decision and action. The Germans had moved faster than their enemies could think, and in warfare, when you can't think fast enough to respond, you lose. Not eventually, not after a long struggle, immediately. That was the revolution of 1940. That was what changed warfare forever. Not better tanks or planes or guns, but better tempo, quicker decisions, quicker adaptations, the ability to stay inside the enemy's head and never let them catch up. And once that lesson was learned, once every military in the world understood that speed of decision-making mattered as much as strength of firepower, warfare would never be the same again. The age of speed had arrived, and it's never left.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.